This is Puzzle Problem Mess. Conversations about the media economy and how to think clearly when things get messy. In this episode, I'm delighted to bring you a conversation with Doug Shapiro about the foundational changes underway in media. Doug is a US-based independent consultant and advisor, writer, speaker and lecturer, as well as a senior advisor at Boston Consulting Group. He has spent his entire career in and around the media business, including 14 years as a media equity analyst and 12 years at Time Warner and WarnerMedia. Doug has also just finished work on a book, Infinite Content, AI, the Next Great Disruption of Media, and How to Navigate What's Coming, which is due to be published by MIT Press in early 2027. Watch out for that one. Doug also writes The Mediator on Substack. I'll put a link in the show notes. And if you do only one thing after listening to this episode, you must take a look at Doug's Media Mental Model, which I'll also link to. It's an exceptionally useful catalogue of the structural changes underway in the media business, bringing together Doug's writing across the different forces reshaping the industry. Do check it out. And now, here's Doug Shapiro. Doug Shapiro, thanks very much for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
You've mentioned in recent conversations you've had that some of the disruption we're seeing today is in fact sort of a lagging indicator of the prior disruption in content distribution. And you're talking about the changes that are ahead of us being much more profound than perhaps the changes we've seen in the last decade. Do you want to talk a bit about that? Why is that?
Sure, of course. Yeah, and I think that is a good place to start. So the reason I write that and say that is because of the breadth of what Gen AI can do, which I don't think is necessarily well understood. I think a lot of the focus is on a relatively important but a relatively narrow application. So to your point, the current state of media was really defined by two technological innovations, two related ones, digitization and the internet. And everybody knows that. And before digitization, there was no common language between different forms of media. They were all siloed. A radio signal doesn't talk to newsprint, doesn't talk to a movie reel or whatever. And so each form of media had to have its own supply chain and form factor. And yeah, you watch the movies in a movie theater and listen to the radio on a radio and all that. And what digitization did was it created this universal language for all media. And the internet created a universal transport mechanism, a universal network. And that really changed the architecture of the media business as we know it. And there were a lot of changes associated with that, but the most important one is that it caused the cost of distribution to become effectively free. It dramatically reduced the cost of distribution. And of course, that birthed Netflix and YouTube and TikTok and Steam and Spotify and all of the things that currently compete for our finite time and attention. But the thing about digitization is that it only is only concerned with syntax. It's only concerned with the grammar or rules for how information is represented. It doesn't care at all. It's very intentionally agnostic to what the information means. And so if you think about, I don't know if this is necessarily the right word, but if you think about the primitives, the things you can do with digitization, or what I call computable info, what happens when information becomes computable, there's a pretty small list, actually. It's things like you can copy it, you can store it, you can compress it, you can transmit it. There's this, like I said, relatively small number of primitives. So if you think about Gen AI in the context of that, Gen AI operates at a higher level of abstraction. It is very much concerned with what information means. That's what Gen AI models are, maps of meaning. That's basically what they are, is that they're a mathematical representation of meaning, which is inferred from the relationships in the data or the patterns and structures within the data. And so when you have machines that understand, or what I refer to as computable meaning as opposed to computable information, the list of primitives is actually very long. It's very much open-ended. And most of what people focus on is the create primitive, that you can make new stuff for very low cost. But it's not just create, it's create and coordinate and verify and synthesize and summarize and convert and translate. And you start making this list and you realize that there isn't really a logical end to it. Each of those primitives have potential implications for the media business. And so we talk a lot about the create primitive, again, the idea that Gen AI is going to reduce the costs of creation, but it's actually only one application of it. So that's what I meant at the very beginning when I said I think that a good place to start is to understand just the sheer breadth of how much generative AI may change the media business.
Great. And just one other thread on that before we move into the sort of broader topics. You've also mentioned that AI might bring about a change in preferences. You say one of your themes is disruption brings about changes in preferences and taste. Do you want to talk a little bit more can you see any early signs of what preferences this might be bringing about or changes in preferences in relation to TV and film?
It is a general consequence of disruption is that it often changes the consumer definition of quality in a way that can be surprising, I think, especially for the people who have been in a business or a domain for a long time. And the analogy that I always use is Airbnb. That when it came out, it just seemed like a really bad idea that anyone was going to pay to sleep on someone else's couch. But what happened was over time, Airbnb introduced all these new attributes of quality. Things like a quaint neighborhood or a working kitchen or more storage space or maybe a barbecue in the backyard or whatever it is. And for a lot of people, it actually changed their definition of quality in leisure travel and leisure lodging. And the first place they look when they go on a vacation or whatever is the first place they look is Airbnb, right? So that's an example of a case where the definition of quality has shifted, and that has been happening in TV and film as well. It gets this question of how you define quality. Is quality some sort of platonic ideal of what is good or what is bad that some expert or somebody has decided? The way I define quality is revealed preference. Quality is what people actually do when given a choice. And so when you look at the shift of consumption away from, let's call it corporate media toward creator media, by inference, we're seeing a shift in the consumer definition of quality. And I used to work at Time Warner, and we owned HBO, and HBO used to be the sort of prototype for quality in television. It had high production values, high budgets, well-known talent. And those things are all still important, but now there are these new attributes of quality that have been introduced by the creator economy, things like authenticity, relatability, digestibility, meaning, is it low friction to find it? I don't know what you call that, discoverability, is it relevant to my sub community? Whatever it is, there are all these new attributes of quality, a lot of which hinge on what I would call, authenticity, parasocial relationships, community, stuff like that. It's a heavy social component to it. And so the unknown question is now we move forward and we're going to have AI affect the media business. Will it also change the consumer definition of quality? We don't know that yet. But one of the interesting things about generative AI that I think also doesn't get discussed very much is the idea of new Gen AI native use cases or applications, right? Most of what we talk about is still how do we use this technology to do the same thing we do today, but just for less money. but it's going to enable all kinds of new stuff too. It's going to enable when you can render video real time, you can have emergent stories or interactive, personalized, contextual stories. You can have multimodal entertainment where you have a book and you press a button and it's a movie, you press a button, it's a podcast, or you're listening to it as a podcast in your car, you go home and you can think of all these kind of fanciful things, and who knows what's actually gonna achieve traction with consumers. But yeah, there is definitely the opportunity for and the likelihood that Gen AI native applications are not only going to compete on the same footing as existing media, but also will introduce new attributes of quality that can be uniquely satisfied or uniquely fulfilled by these new forms.
Great. And you mentioned your time at Time Warner, and I'm particularly interested in your view on how what you term the traditional intermediaries, how they fare in this. Your mental model on Substack is awesome. There's so many jumping off points there. I'll just choose a couple of those. You're talking about this emerging abundance of content as the cost of content production sort of collapses in a similar way that content distribution cost collapsed, leading to an abundance of content. And that will create new scarcities. And it's around those new scarcities that premium value can be built. Do you want to just expand on that a bit more, the notion of sort of emerging or reinforced scarcities as abundance rolls out?
Sure, and that's also that concept is definitely not specific to media. That happens all the time. You can probably go back to prior to the Industrial Revolution, manpower was scarce and land was abundant, and then after the Industrial Revolution, manpower was abundant and land was scarce. There's always this flip-flopping of what is abundant and scarce. So when one thing when one input into the value chain becomes abundant, the other what economists call complements, the complements around that good become scarcer and more valuable. And so if you think of examples like in agriculture, stick with that theme, when crop yields rose, food became more abundant, and so value shifted into distribution, food processing, brands, right? If you think about digital photography basically made the cost of photography go to zero, right? And value shifted into what became relatively scarce, which was editing software, storage, and of course, photo sharing networks. Instagram has been a massive beneficiary of the plummeting cost of photography. So that's the general idea. The general idea is that when one thing becomes abundant, other things become scarce.
In relation to traditional intermediaries, how do you see that playing out? What are the things that traditional intermediaries have today that become more scarce? Or what are some of the emerging scarcities that you think traditional intermediaries are best placed to sort of own and chase after and try and unlock some of that premium value?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about the emerging scarcities is, not only what becomes um, newly hard, what becomes newly cheap, or what becomes newly possible. And so, you could think about in a world of abundant content, some things become relatively scarce, like human provenance, right? Proof that a human made it, or authenticity, or a brand, or the ability to market it. I mean, there's a couple of kind of obvious things. One of the things I talk about is the idea of professional validation. So, I mean, I'll just introduce this idea. Maybe we can kind of tease it out or not. But if you think about the music labels as major music labels as an analogy, they went through a period of effectively content becoming infinite, right? The role that they played in the value chain shifted a lot in the kind of in the decade from, let's say, 2015 to 2025, because a lot of the things they used to do, such as finance production and assemble talent and do the marketing and the distribution, became democratized. It became possible to do for independent artists to do all those things themselves. They could record their own stuff. Billie Eilish can record a multi-platinum album in her brother's studio. You can market on your own socials. You can self-distribute on Spotify or SoundCloud. But what the labels did a good job of doing was still reasserting their value in the value chain. And so today, almost every new artist that emerges in music emerges out of the tail of self-distribution. You know, they start on TikTok or YouTube or Spotify or SoundCloud or whatever. Once they have a hit, pretty much they all go and then sign with Universal or Warner or something like that. You know, and part of the reason for that is that they want the professional validation. And so for the existing intermediaries, that is one potential source of scarcity. But there's a lot of areas, there's a lot of things that they can still do that are not going to be democratized by technology.
Yeah, great. And you've got a long list on your Substack and they're all fascinating. There's two that I really wanted to tease out a little bit with you. One was this, and you mentioned it, compelling original stories, human authenticity, provenance, and craft. And that presents a challenge perhaps for traditional intermediaries in that they're hooked onto the big scale content, mass production values, hard for them to pivot into more craft and provenance. How do you see that sort of tension between what a traditional intermediary does at scale and this notion of craft and authenticity?
I think it's definitely a challenge. And the if you think about it, to back up again and think about disruption more broadly, the what generally happens in disruption is that you have incumbents who have established some sort of, definition of value for consumers, and then the upstarts come, the insurgents come, and they always start at the bottom of the curve. They always pick off the least demanding customers or customers that have actually been priced out of the market altogether, and then they keep marching up the performance curve. They keep getting better and better and better. Again, you can think about Airbnb. Initially they were really appealing to customers who couldn't even afford a hotel room, and then it was those who could afford a cheap hotel room, and they kept marching up the curve. And today you could go on Airbnb and you can rent a luxury villa that comes with a chef and all these, I forget what they call it, some kind of Airbnb experiences. Anyway, they've gone all the way to the top of the curve. At least for leisure travel, they have not. They really can't compete for business customers, but let's put that to the side. So anyway, there's always this dynamic where the insurgents come from the bottom and keep moving up the curve. So the question becomes, as the incumbents get kind of backed into a corner, right? They get backed up the curve. How big is that high end of the market? Like, how big is that high end of the market that the insurgent can't get to? So that becomes the question here too, is, let's say that there is this resilient top end of the market for franchise IP, very scarce experiences, big blockbusters, or something that the insurgents can't attack, even with the help of AI. The question is simply, well, okay, great, but how big is that market? And the further complication is that for most of the companies that play in that market, their business is largely funded by that sort of mediocre middle that's going to be commoditized. Like, there's not a lot of companies that only play in the very high end of the, there's A24, or there's little niche producers that might only play in the very high end of the prestige end of the market. But for large media conglomerates, large media companies, there's very few that can say they do that. And so that becomes the challenge, is, or to put it a different way, is the thing that makes that stuff at the top end attractive its scarcity also the thing that inherently caps the size of the market?
Really interesting. If I could just roll back to one of the other scarcities that you touched on, and it's this notion of validation. You're talking about the music labels. And if we take a lens that's more global, I think a lot of your thinking and a lot of way I read your thinking tends to focus around the big studio broadcaster streamer entities. But if you look at a more national level, say in Europe or where I am today in Australia, there's a middle class of media institutions that are national in nature that have in the past provided that form of professional validation. And they're all under strain of similar sorts. But do you see that the sort of scarcity of validation might end up having a bit of a barbell effect where you've got fewer and fewer genuinely validatory institutions and the middle, perhaps the national validators, national broadcasters sort of over time lose their validation impact?
It's hard to say. It's hard to say. I think it really depends on uh, the the value of the validation is directly correlated to the value of the brand.
Mm,
And so I think it's a hard thing to say. By their nature, most big national brands are going to have somewhat middle of the road or big national broadcasters are going to have somewhat middle of the road brands just because they have to operate at scale. And so the sort of the structural risk is that those brands lose value over time and that the validation value is not that great. But that's kind of a hard thing to say. Does the What is the value of the validation from the BBC? I mean, the other thing is, you know, I don't want to, I don't know, want to over rotate on this idea of the value of professional validation because most of, if we're talking about, this content, I mean, again, it's hard to make, it's hard to draw too many generalizations because traditional studios are in the business of cultivating, developing, and producing an idea and owning the IP, and then distributing it, marketing, packaging, aggregating it, whatever. It depends if they're vertically integrated or not. And there's certain economics associated with IP ownership. If we're now talking about making a shift where they're not in the business of owning the IP, but they're in the business of attracting other people's IP and then monetizing, marketing, and whatever, that's a different business, different economics, different margin structures, a different culture. So so as a starting point, like that's not an easy transition in and of itself before you even get to this question of, well, who still has a brand that even has any kind of validatory or whatever the word is. How many of these companies even still have brands that actually have some kind of validation value? So there's before you get to that question, you have, I think, an even more fundamental question, which is how easy a transition is that to make?
mm. Yes. This is a good segue actually to one of the other themes you've observed around as content supply balloons, it's possible that media becomes to be thought of as marketing as the gateway into the primary monetization rather than being, a gateway into ancillary monetization. Do you want to just unpack that notion of content as marketing a bit more? I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the idea there is that as supply increases, uh, well, barriers to entry come down. This is the Econ 101, right? The barriers to entry come down, new entrants will enter the market, there will be a flood of supply, and prices go down, and then consumers become more price sensitive. And value shifts from this newly abundant thing into the complements, and whoever owns the complements in the value chain generally is incented to commoditize the abundant thing to drive value their direction. And so what ends up happening over time is that pricing moves toward marginal cost. In these perfectly competitive markets, pricing heads toward marginal cost. Um, in media, marginal cost is zero. So when pricing heads toward marginal cost, it means pricing heads toward free. And if you and so we're already seeing that happen in the media business, and we have seen it happen. So if you think about examples like, again, to talk about music, the value or the cost of record or price of recorded music has really plummeted. So if you think about how much you paid per hour to consume a CD versus how much you pay per hour to consume Spotify, Spotify is about 1/10. The cost of recorded music has fallen. And so the value has shifted to, in this case, largely to live events. It used to be that you would go on tour to promote the album. Now you put out the album to promote the tour. If you think about what's happened in gaming, in AAA gaming, the publishers will spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a game, and the only way they can monetize that kind of investment really is to charge a lot for the cartridges or discs. You know, you pay 80 US or 70 or whatever, 69.99 to buy the game itself. So the AAA game developers monetize the gameplay, but in mobile gaming, it costs orders of magnitude less to create a mobile game, and almost all mobile games are now free. They're all free to play, and they're not monetizing the gameplay per se. What they monetize is status. You know, you buy like emotes or skins or digital goods or, you know, power ups or something like that. You know, they're monetizing something other than the gameplay itself. And what's happening in video, which is very interesting, I think, you know, lately, is that you're seeing this really big swing back toward ad supported models. And, you know, all the SVOD players that were supposed to herald the end of TV advertising, you know, Netflix and Amazon and Disney Plus, they all obviously now have ad supported tiers. You have just in the last couple of weeks, speculation that Disney Plus is preparing to launch a free ad supported tier. Paramount Plus is making more content free. Peacock just did this deal with YouTube yesterday, where they're going to be bundling Peacock in with YouTube Premium, which is also sort of tacitly a shift toward ad support. So you're kind of what I think you're seeing across the media landscape is lower willingness to pay. So lower willingness by consumers to pay directly for content. And so if that's where we're headed, then it means that the content itself is going to have to increasingly be top of funnel for something else. And you say, well, what is that something else? And it could be, um, you know, it could be advertising. It could be other forms of super fan monetization, like merchandise or, you know, events or, you know, early access or fan creation or whatever it may be. But that is a very, for a business that's used to the content itself being the profit center, not the cost center. That's a pretty big shift.
Yeah. Yeah, and those companies, you know, three of the companies you mentioned there, Disney, Paramount, NBCU, you know, within the sort of Peacock Comcast family, but they're all well schooled in franchise management. You know, that's in their DNA. They for many years have leveraged theatrical releases, you know, theme parks, etc., consumer products. And for a traditional intermediary, perhaps at a national level, that's not really been in that franchise game, it's a big organizational pivot to make, isn't it? To get into that mindset or that cultural practice of franchise management.
Oh yeah, it's. I would say there aren't a lot. Even the big companies, there are not a lot that I would say Disney does it well, and you know, there's that famous image that Walt Disney drew in 1957 of the interlocking pieces of all the businesses and how they all kind of revolve around the IP. But they do it better than anybody, and I again, you know, I worked at Time Warner, and I would say Warner Brothers was okay at it. It really tends to be when I was at Turner, actually, for a short while, I oversaw this effort to create a centralized 360-degree monetization group. So it was going to be a central group that was going to work with the brands, work with Turner Sports and CNN and Turner Entertainment to help develop the franchises and find other forms of monetization. And we were going to have a gaming expert and a merch licensing expert and events experts, and the concept being there'd be sort of like a internal centers of excellence that would then work with the brands to help develop these new forms of monetization. And it's really, really hard. It's typically an afterthought. It's typically something where
Mm.
those people don't have a seat at at the development table. It's more like, okay, we made a hit. You guys go figure out how to monetize it now, which is not really the way to do it. The way to do it would be to think much more holistically around from the very get-go about how the content and these various other forms of monetization may work together in lockstep. It's so I would say that you're right. It's very hard organizationally. I don't think a lot of companies do it well. And the other thing is it's labor intensive. It tends to be lower margin than the core business, so that's yet another
Mm.
reason to not get a lot
Mm.
of focus. When you think about content creation businesses, typically there's development people who are, have like the highest status in the company. And if you said, okay, the live events or the merch person's going to now sit at the green light table with the other,
Mm.
with the development folks and help them decide what to make or what not to make, the the head development people would look at like you had three heads. Like, what are you talking about? Like that? No, no, I do that. I tell them when to get involved. They don't tell me what to make or not make. So,
Mm.
um, one thing I think is interesting is if you in a lot of media businesses, the fundamental economic unit is the IP. So you think about like gaming, they'll run games. In a lot of cases, they're organized around the gaming franchise. In music, they're by its nature organized around the artist is the franchise. I think Mattel recently reorganized around its various franchises. That's not how most big media companies work, that they actually are organized around the distribution channel so that the content is in service of the distribution, not that the distribution is in service of the content. And
Mm. Mm.
so, you'd almost say, well, if you really were to do this well, you would organize a media company around its franchises. You'd have a creative lead and a business lead on every franchise. They would be incented to optimize the value of the franchise and decide how to distribute it and where to distribute it, all those kinds of things. Again, that's like a really radical idea. And if any, I think for most big media companies, if they tried to transition toward that, it would break them. That's just like
Yes.
such a radical concept. But yeah, no, that's not easy in any way, culturally, operationally. Yeah, that's a super tough thing to do. If you think about content as top of funnel, it then by implication, the bottom of the funnel is always smaller than the top of the funnel, right? There's fewer people at the bottom of the funnel. What you're saying is we're gonna we're gonna put out a lot of stuff, or not a lot of stuff. We're gonna put out the stuff to a lot of people, but we realize we're gonna be monetizing some kind of super fans at a higher level. The uh, that's just a lot of media businesses are not oriented to think that way, but it really means that you should be engaging those people on a continuous basis. You
Mm.
shouldn't be putting out a piece of content every 5 years. You can't put out a Fast and Furious every 3 or 4 years and hope the fans come back. You
Mm.
should really be figuring out how do we. It's almost that media would have, just like a software did, media has to go from being a product to a service, an
Mm.
ongoing thing that you're giving the biggest fans the opportunity to engage with it continuously. Again, like these are all very challenging changes for a media company.
Yes, and so I'm going to push you into highly speculative territory now on exactly that theme. So let's just acknowledge that. But if you think about it, maybe ex-US, a national market in Europe or APAC or somewhere, and we're talking about the intermediaries needing to shift themselves to be able to leverage new scarcities or monetize complements, or as you say, shift their thinking from a product to a service. A lot of them won't be able to make the shift. What do you think it means for market structures in those markets?
I don't think it's good. I think it's meaning I think that there's a that the I think the word the world's going is that it will barbell.
Mm,
And in the sense that there will be value that shifts to this, the scarce IP, scarce experiences, the few companies that can make this transition, that can reorient themselves toward these emerging scarcities or the complements that are getting more valuable on the one hand, and then it's going to also shift to the 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 entities, the platforms that control the consumer relationship and control the moment of consumer choice. And right now, that is Netflix and TikTok and Spotify and Steam and Reels and YouTube, right? But the word barbell is probably not a good word because it implies that the two sides are of equal size. And I think the latter, the entities that control that moment of choice, that consumer relationship, are positioned to be much, much more larger and much more powerful. And so the middle is gonna, I'm not sure, I don't see any way around it, and I'm happy to have someone explain to me the opposing case, but the middle I think is going to get really squeezed. And so it comes back to the question I asked or raised before, which is even for the companies that currently operate in that the head of the quality curve in that area of scarcity, there's a fundamental question. There are two fundamental questions, which is can you scale that? Number one, and number two, if you're being funded in large part by that commoditizing middle, are you even going to be able to financially survive that transition? So if you think about a broadcaster, right? A broadcaster historically has created value through aggregation, curation, distribution. All of those things are going to be commoditized, to be
mm,
frank. And so can what do they do about it? Do they move upstream into more content ownership, IP ownership? Maybe, but that's financially quite challenging.
mm,
Do they you know get much better at aggregating or curating? Do they end up, and that gets to your question about having a brand, that a validating brand, a curating brand? Maybe that's a
mm,
possibility, but also, I think that there's a question about what's the competitive moat around that? How
mm,
powerful is that? I mean, we could one going back to the very beginning, we talked about this idea of computable meaning and all of the different primitives associated with that. But one of the primitives is coordinate, that what AI is going to be able to do is help people find stuff. And if you think about an AI coordination, so for the most part, coordination happens at the level of the platform. And a lot of the value actually that these platforms have in owning that moment of consumer choice is because that is a coordination role. It's not just distribution, but it's coordination. So there's a really big question about whether that coordination migrates to a new AI coordination layer, and maybe it's ChatGPT, maybe it's Anthropic or whatever. But you could imagine this thing that knows you really well because you're talking to it all the time. It understands your preferences. It understands your context. It's reading your email. It knows you have a long car ride tomorrow. It knows your boss sent you a kind of uh, you know a, a crappy email today and you might be in a bad mood, whatever. And its interests may be much more aligned with yours. You may say, you know what, I'm really feeling bad, I've been scrolling too much on social, can you please direct me toward this kind of content? Or it may say, you haven't actually watched Paramount Plus in 2 months. Maybe you want to cancel it. The Paramount Plus UI is probably not going to advise you to cancel Paramount Plus. So in theory, an AI coordination layer could be a much better mousetrap, a much better consumer experience. And so if you're in the media business and your main function is curating, that could be completely disintermediated by AI. And way before the consumer gets to you, they've already made decisions long before they show up at your door, or deep link into your into your library of content. And you become basically sort of a nothing more than kind of like a content API call or a
Mm.
content backend, which is no place you want to be. If you don't own the IP, then your value has been entirely eroded. So yeah, I don't know if that's a particularly uplifting place to end, but yeah, I mean the world, and it's hard for people to get their heads around, but um, again, it gets back to what I said at the very beginning about why these changes maybe even why the media business may change more in the next decade than it has in the last two.
Thanks, Doug. So, Doug, given there are these tectonic shifts underway as you frame them, what's your advice for someone who's starting their career in media or mid-career in media and can see or sense this happening around them? How should they think about career?
It's a good question. I think for one thing, they should not be afraid of AI. They should work with the tools, learn how they're being used. The all the gray hairs like me who are in running these media businesses are going to need the help of people who know what they're doing. And so I think there's an opportunity to become even more valuable by really understanding these things. I know there's a lot of kind of visceral emotional rejection of AI, and it's not art and it's slop and all these kinds of things. I encourage people not to put their head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist, because I think in a lot of ways, I think we've been in this very binary, black and white world, is bad or it's good. Whereas it's going to be, I think in a few years, it'll be like debating whether electricity was bad or good. It's going to be diffused into everything. You're going to be working on video where you're in Premiere Pro and you're combining real footage with something you made in Blender and then something generative, and then it gets all mashed together and rendered out. And at the end, no one's going to know what was AI, what wasn't AI. So that would be number one. Would is just to embrace the tools, because I don't think they're going away. The second thing, I think it's helpful to think about these scarcities, this idea of what will be scarce as content is abundant, to think about some of these potential tectonic shifts in where one sits in the value chain. Again, when you think about the platforms and how much value they've created by owning both the distribution and the coordination. If that coordination gets unbundled and moves to another level, what does that mean? What does that mean for Netflix? What does that mean for Spotify? What is, whatever. Just so to be mindful of how bargaining power may shift up and down the value chain. And I guess the third thing is I would encourage people to be uh, willing to be fluid in their career decisions. That we may be entering an era where one just needs to kind of be willing to move more quickly and not stay at a place for a decade and see what happens. And I don't I don't know. I mean, it does feel to me like the pace of change is accelerating, and I think everyone should be going into their career with their eyes open about that.
Doug, thank you very much for this. This has been a incredibly rich conversation, and there's lots and lots in this for people to mull over. So thanks for your time this morning.
All right, great. Thank you, Dan.
That was Doug Shapiro leaving us with so much to think about. Thanks for listening. I'm Dan Fay. Original music by Lee Reservoir and SoCal. And if you like this episode, please pass it on to a friend or colleague.